É sempre um prazer aqui para o IBRAC receber convidados estrangeiros tão ilustres e que tanto contribuem para aprofundar a discussão e a troca de ideias, que é justamente o elemento central do nosso seminário. E nós somos muito afortunados hoje porque temos a oportunidade de ter uma mesa redonda com 7 autoridades e advogados estrangeiros, a quem eu gostaria de agradecer não apenas por participarem desse nosso painel, dessa nossa mesa redonda, mas também pelo tempo que cada um dedicou na preparação desse painel. Nós tivemos, a Silvia e eu, calls individuais, muitos e-mails. Eu acho que eles já dedicaram muito mais tempo do que eles imaginariam que dedicariam para o painel antes de sentar aqui. Então, também por isso, nosso muito obrigado. Um breve comentário só sobre a estrutura do painel. A ideia é ter definitivamente uma mesa redonda, um diálogo muito livre, com a participação de todos os presentes, que não precisa esperar até o final das perguntas que nós faremos. Então, por favor, fiquem à vontade para perguntar. Enquanto estamos já tendo a nossa dinâmica, faremos perguntas para cada um dos panelistas, eles também farão perguntas uns aos outros. A ideia é ter um bate-papo técnico bom e com ideias a serem debatidas e aprofundadas. Sem mais delongas, Silvia.
Bom dia a todos. Eu vou começar a primeira pergunta falando com a doutora Eleonora, doutora Eleonora Ocello, do DigiComp da European Commission. Obrigada novamente por fazer parte desse painel. E acho que a primeira questão tem bastante a ver com o contexto que a gente está nesse momento aqui no Brasil, com o lançamento do Guia de Remédios, e é justamente sobre isso que a gente vai começar conversando. Então, o CAD lançou recentemente o guia, que reflete uma preferência por remédios estruturais, ao invés de remédios comportamentais. Então, eu queria saber um pouco a sua opinião, como é que a Comissão Europeia se posiciona a esse respeito.
Thank you very much for the question and for inviting me here. So also at EU level, we have a preference for structural remedies. So our guidelines and also the case law identify as main requirements of remedies the fact that they have to entirely move the competition concern identified by the Commission. They have to be comprehensive and effective from all point of view, and they also need to be able to be implemented in practice. And we found that these requirements are much easier to be fulfilled in the case of a structural remedy, in particular when we have horizontal concerns. Actually, we had experience with behavioral remedies accepted in the context of horizontal cases, and not a long time ago, and we found that eventually they were not effective. So I would like to share with you this experience. A few years ago, but still ongoing, in Europe started a wave of consolidation in the mobile telecom industry. These are cases which are not cooperation cases because they are mainly, let's say, having effects at national level in the various EU countries, but the EU had the chance to review them. And we found that in these cases that there were strong horizontal effects, anti-competitive effects which could have arisen. And the remedies which was proposed was a behavioral one. So if you know, like in the context of the mobile industry, we have two types of operators. There are mobile telecom operators which operate on the basis of their own infrastructure, so they have the network and they sell retail services to their customers. And then there are other operators that we call mobile virtual network operators, which provide their services to their customer on the basis of a wholesale access to the network of the other category of operators. So the remedies that in these horizontal cases that I mentioned earlier were offered, in particular in 2 cases in 2014, in the mobile telecom mergers in Ireland and in Germany, were identified as divestment of capacity, of network capacity. So what meant was that the merging party were offering to potential new entrant or other operator in the market a chunk of their capacity to then offer retail services to their customer. The point is that this was beyond the name divestiture, in fact, a behavioral remedy. And what we found was that the implementation was very difficult, and that there was a huge delay in the, let's say, kickoff of the remedy because of technical issue in implementing it, and the threat of the entry, because some of these remedies were also upfront, did not have also any type of impact on the market. So there has been some ex post studies, in particular this year was published by the IBRAC, which is the body of a regulator, of European regulator of electronic communication, which studied the effects of mergers in these two cases. They found that there were high price increases in these markets after the mergers, which were cleared by the Commission, closed. And why is that? We have thought a lot about it, and what we found was that behavioral remedy are very complex, and the key feature that create problems beyond the specificity of each different remedy was the lack of what we define future-proofness. So when you have a behavioral remedy, you need to be able to foresee all the possible situations that could arise in the market, and this is very difficult. But that's what we faced. There were situations which were not completely covered in the commitments, or it was difficult to interpret the commitment. There is a lot of litigation, and the facts were not good at all. In 2016, we reviewed another mobile telecom merger, in Italy. And there, after this experience that we gained, the remedy that we required was a structural one. But structural does not mean only divestiture of a going concern. The remedy that we had in that context was actually a divestiture of the key inputs, which would have allowed the remedy taker to build its own nationwide network. And then what was the divestiture capacity in the other cases was also accepted here, but it was only as a transitional service agreement to support the remedy taker during the rollout of its network on the basis of the input and the assets that they had acquired. And we found that the differences in terms of effectiveness of this type of divestiture remedy was uncomparable with respect to the one that we had accepted, the behavioral one. So also in this case, the remedy taker, let's say, took quite a lot of time to enter, but it's because the mobile industry requires time for all the setup. So the decision clearing the merger was adopted in 2016, and the merger closed in 2016. The commercial launch of the remedy taker was only this year. However, in the almost 2 years of, let's say, preparation, there was no price increase in Italy. Actually, the conditional competition remained at pre-merger level, and Italy featured a lot of competition in the mobile telecom market. And also, at the end, when the mobile remedy taker entered, it had a lot of success. So in only 3 months, it managed to acquire 2 million customers. And these show a bit the difference also in terms of perception by the other player in the market, the remaining operator, of the different type of threat that an operator like this, which has a structure and it will enter with all the assets to be a let's say, operator with infrastructure has on the market. This, however, doesn't mean that behavioral remedies cannot be accepted in general. It all depends at the end on the theories of harm. And for those who had the patience of listen to me yesterday, actually in a lot of conglomerate, but also vertical cases, we have accepted behavioral remedies.
Ok, muito obrigada. Acho que os pontos que você traz de preocupação são muito parecidos. Acredito que os pontos que você trouxe de preocupação com remédios comportamentais são muito parecidos com o que o CAD deve entender como preocupação na aplicação desse tipo de remédio, conforme a gente até discutiu um pouco no painel, no primeiro painel aqui do seminário. Você trouxe exemplos aqui de telecomunicações, e acho que mercados relacionados a ele, como mercados digitais e mercados de tecnologia, são operações que têm acontecido com frequência também. E nessa toada, eu queria entender um pouco melhor, que você compartilhasse um pouco com a gente a experiência da Comissão Europeia no que se refere a operações e até que ponto algumas operações, as decisões acabaram envolvendo questões relacionadas a dados. Até que ponto essas questões foram cruciais para decidir por uma direção ou outra pela Comissão Europeia.
Thank you. The data issue is, especially under our current commissioner, a very important one. We have also some advisors which have been appointed to dig in the issue of the digital market and the data issue to see whether there is a need for a reform of additional tools. But a specific regard with data, so far I think the Commission has quite a lot of experience. The first cases where data were something that had to be assessed and the issue around data had to be assessed date back 2008 with Google DoubleClick. To have many other mergers. However, let's say in general, Facebook, WhatsApp, of Microsoft, LinkedIn, which are more recent, are referred to the one where these issues were more prominent. The fact is that they were not the first, but indeed we look into this a bit more in depth, and also we were aware and gave attention to related issue with respect to data protection and the implication in the context of the merger review. Out of, let's say, the practice that the Commission has acquired, we have identified 4 possible ways in which data come into play in the assessment of mergers. One is, and the first is data as an input. So when data is used as an input to then provide the service downstream. And this type of assessment, when there is a data market, so when data are licensed to third parties, is basically can be assessed on the basis of the traditional framework of vertical effects. We found that that structure of assessment was quite effective, and there was no need. I mean, so far we have identified no need to improve our framework. The second aspect instead is when we look at data as an asset, which can afford the advantage to their companies which maintain a database, which is considered to have a particular value. In this case, data normally are not as such sold to third party or to customers, but they are used as indeed as an asset to then provide service. For example, in advertising, Google or Facebook, they collect data, and on that basis, they target advertising to end users of their services, like search engine of Google or the social network of Facebook. So we haven't identified in these cases a data market, but what we have done was to assess the possible effects of data combination when the 2 merging companies are data set, sometimes complementary, sometimes similar, which were merged together. In this type of scenario, to the extent that aggregation of the 2 data sets is possible, here there are some data protection issue and other contractual possible restriction, but I will not talk about that. Only when this aggregation is possible, we have 2 types of situation where we can have competition concerns. The first is when the 2 parties are actually competing head-to-head at horizontal level in 2 markets where the data are used as basically input. So there is competition downstream, and we look at the implication of the aggregation, also the data upstream. But also when parties are not active, let's say, competing in the same market, we could have issue as a result of data combination. This was what we assessed both in Facebook, WhatsApp, but also very recently in Apple Shazam. So in these cases, basically we looked whether the combination of data, despite there is no elimination of competition between the parties, could, for example, raise barrier to entries with respect to competitors, or make it more difficult for competitors who are already in the market to exert competitive pressures. The most extensive or sophisticated analysis in this respect is actually in Apple Shazam. The decision is not published yet, but I can anticipate something because this is not confidential. In that case, we assessed whether the combination of the data that Shazam was collecting together with the data that Apple had in terms of music taste of user could have strengthened the position of Apple Music in the market for music streaming services, where Apple Music was competing with Spotify or Deezer in Europe. I don't know if you have a Deezer here. The type of analysis we did there was basically to benchmark the relevance of the data set of Shazam against the one of other competitors or against the one of other players active in the market, which could enter into partnership with other provider of music streaming services. And the analysis that we have done look at the so-called the 4 Vs that if you are familiar with the study, I mean, it's in a lot of literature, but also in the study published by the French and German competition authorities. So variety, velocity, volume, and value of the data. And on the basis of these analyses and different parameters that we have used to assess the various V, we found that the data that Shazam had were not particularly unique, and as such, so the transaction didn't raise any concern with respect to data. The third and fourth aspect, which data can be relevant, so after input asset, are interlinked. So the third would be data as a currency for services. This is called the zero price services, which is nothing else than the other side of the coin of data protection as quality. Indeed, when services are offered for free, in fact, they are not for free, but oftentimes the service provider collects data, and a merger can cause harm if reduce the competitive pressure in the case of an horizontal merger, but also in the context of other theories of harm, also as a reduction of quality in terms of data protection, which in turn can be read as an increase of price, so the data which are collected.
Ok. Muito obrigada por compartilhar essa experiência com a gente. Certamente é um tema que demanda ainda bastante discussão e é muito dinâmico, assim como o próprio mercado que envolve essa discussão. Muito obrigada, Eleonora. Vou passar aqui a palavra para o Francisco continuar com as questões.
Obrigado, Silvia. Obrigado, Eleonora. Agora a gente vai passar por umas perguntas para Cunzhen Huang, que tem a sua prática tanto na China como nos Estados Unidos, pelo Cleary Gottlieb. Ainda seguindo o que começamos a discutir com a Eleonora, no tema de remédios concorrenciais, e aproveitando naturalmente a sua experiência na China, a gente teria 3 perguntas iniciais sobre remédios, né? Primeiro, se a China sempre costuma requerer remédios nos casos em que a União Europeia e os Estados Unidos também exigem remédios, né? Se a China gosta de ter Me Too remedies, né? Depois, se a China procura impor ou tem a intenção de impor remédios sempre mais rigorosos que a União Europeia e os Estados Unidos. E, nesse contexto, como funciona e como tem funcionado a prática de coordenação internacional entre a China e a União Europeia, os Estados Unidos e outras jurisdições, eventualmente, inclusive o Brasil.
Thank you, Francisco. So to first address the first question about whether China always require Me Too remedy if that is required in the EU or US, the answer is not really, especially if the geographic market can be defined as national or regional within national jurisdiction, and if the local Chinese concerns, including non-antitrust related, for example, industry conservation concerns, are well addressed, it's very possible that MOFCOM SMR still issue unconditional clearance in spite of the fact that remedies are attached to the transaction in the EU or in the US. So that's happened a couple of times since 2014, including in cases we were involved. For example, GSK Novartis, Medtronic Covendin, and Lafarge Holcim. So all the cases were approved with conditions in the US or in the EU and in the EU, but were unconditional cleared in China, including the recent cases whose review in the EU was still pending, Siemens Alstom and Thales Geomoto. So these 2 cases were unconditional cleared in China. So in short, there is still hope in China. As with regard to whether China tends to impose stricter and more rigorous remedies than, for example, EU and US. Oh, by the way, I really wanted to compare to CAGIA's practice as well, but it's a little bit difficult for me because I cannot read decisions in Portuguese. So for now, maybe next time I will improve on that, but for now I only compare China to EU and the US. Not necessarily and not always, but true in majority of the cases. So since 2014, China has issued 18 conditional approvals, and in majority of them, China indeed imposed stricter remedies. I think in 3 transactions, including thermal official, life technology, Dow DuPont, and agri-potash, MOFCOM required behavioral remedies in addition to structural remedies that were required in the EU and US. And then in 6 transactions, including Microsoft Nokia, Octo, as well as HP, Samsung, EssilorLuxottica, where there were no remedies imposed in the EU and US, China imposed behavioral remedies. So why China prefers to impose behavioral remedies? I think the main reason is behavioral remedies are more easily to be utilized to address non-antitrust related concerns. For example, your Chinese competitors or Chinese customers have some industry considerations which are not merger specific, which would exist with or without merger. Even for forward, the concerns will still exist, so you should not impose remedies from the antitrust point of view on the transactions, but it's a different way of handling that in China. So SMR found it is relatively easy, convenient to use behavioral remedy to address all those concerns. But interesting, MOFCOM required less remedies than the US in BAF, AB, SAB, Miller case. You could argue that was because market is national, the competitive landscape is different in China. But that also happened to UTC Goodrich back to 2012, where US also requires some behavioral remedies, whereas China did not. That was a global market defended in MOFCOM decision. And more recently in Abbott syndromatical case, which we were involved, MOFCOM required a little bit narrower scope of remedy in China. So all this shows with efforts and with a bit of luck, you might get a better result in China than in the EU or US. So to the third and last question about merger remedies, how China coordinated with the rest of the world. So as briefly mentioned yesterday in the panel about merger review globally, China has very frequently coordinated with US and EU, and more recently, more frequently with South Africa and Russia. I understand there was MOU, international cooperation, signed between China and Brazil in 2017. So it's really exciting to see what will happen between coordination between these 2 jurisdictions. And China also more recently put some more efforts into coordinating with other jurisdictions in terms of remedy design and remedy cooperation. It always urged the parties to keep China in the loop when discussing remedies, but the parties, in my experience, tend not to do that because they are, I think in the mindset, still feel prioritization should be placed with US and EU. And China authority was quite antagonized by the fact. They wanted to be more involved. And actually, it could be beneficial for the parties to involve China a little bit earlier. For example, in upfront buyer case in the US, normally FTC typically require quite short time interval between the closing of the main transaction and also the closing of the divestiture. So if you have a post-transaction divestiture with MOFCOM, as companies normally do, you have to wait for MOFCOM to review the identity of the buyer, suitability of the buyer, and then approve the divestiture post-transaction. It would take time. If FTC asks you to close your divestiture after closing of main transaction within 15 or 20 days, which is normally seen, then you would not have enough time. Then you have to bear that in mind when you negotiate the consent decree with FTC. But if you loop China in earlier enough, you could get your buyer approved at the same time in the same decision which approves your main transaction. That happened 3 times in NXP Freescale, in Abbott Syndromatical, and also in InBev SAB Miller. among the 3 cases, only in Apple Syndrome Medical, the buyer is non-Chinese. So it remains to be seen whether for non-Chinese buyer, it is beneficial to do that, to ask for fixed deferred or upfront buyer divestiture, because some companies understandably have concern about the selection of the buyer, whether SMR and MOFCON would prefer to select a Chinese buyer, which would make the buyer selection process longer, more complicated, which would also make a delay in approving your main transaction if you are advocating for a fixed or first or upfront buyer. Thank you.
Thank you, Cunzhen. We have actually a couple of questions from the table to you already. You have sparked interest to a peak. I'm sorry, em português. Temos 2 perguntas da mesa, você realmente conseguiu gerar muito interesse com a sua intervenção. Primeiro, Rafique, e depois o John Boyce.
The question, and maybe it's a comment, is I think statistics tell you so much and they give you part of the story, but maybe not the full story. And I think what you were mentioning yesterday, I think was key in terms of the importance of engaging with stakeholders in the Chinese process to have a smoother outcome. And I think I think it's a bit unfair to say that China will always do a Me Too type remedy or always ask for something harsher, and I think you've demonstrated that pretty clearly. But I think is it fair to say that the success that you are likely to face in China is driven by 2 key factors? The first is, what industry are we talking about? And how interested is China in that industry, whether it's a commodity or technology or a health science type product that they're interested in? And the second, how successful have you been with the stakeholder engagement?
Yes, I fully agree. So even if you have very straightforward case, in the view of a more mature jurisdiction like US, EU, including Brazil, you are more mature than China in terms of merger control review. It could still attract a lot of attention from Chinese government, Chinese stakeholders, trade associations. It's very important that your case is not in, for example, natural resources, industry, agriculture, semiconductor. If unfortunately your case falls into these sensitive industries in Chinese government's view, then you would have to really pay much more efforts in engaging with your stakeholders. So back to the second point Rafi mentioned, it is indeed a very important part of the merger control clearance process in China to actively engage with your stakeholders. So for one reason, you can find the possible concerns upfront and then make a strategy how to address them. And another reason is all the stakeholders will escalate their concerns to SMR, and SMR will, in case of proposed remedies, market test these remedies with stakeholders. You want to keep your communication channel open with them so that at every step you have opportunity to speak with them. In some cases, based on not publicly available information, the parties were able to strike a deal with stakeholders under the table. So you have a deal with stakeholders, the deal was approved without conditions. The good benefit is nobody knows what you have done with your stakeholders, so your non-Chinese competitor or non-Chinese customers might not have that as a benchmark to ask for something similar. At the same time, I think very importantly, you do not have to bear the compliance cost. It's very expensive. A lot of companies just want to get their deal through without thinking about compliance costs, always thinking about it, but prefer not to put more prioritization over compliance cost. Monitoring trustee could be very painful in terms of fee and in terms of the intrusive interventionist approaches it might take when monitoring your business.
Thank you.
Muito obrigado. John?
Yeah, a bit like Rafique, I just wanted to make some observations before touching on a couple of issues, and in fact Rafique's touched on some of the observations I was wanting to make, which proves that we've not been coordinating. But I just think it's useful when you're looking at China to remember that it's a very different economy from Europe and Brazil and the US, and you have to respect that. They organize society in a very different way, and it's a huge economy as well, and therefore I find it not at all surprising if they want to look at mergers and come up with different solutions which are right for them in China. And then another observation is that when you're actually on a particular case, it is more difficult, I think, for the regulators to cooperate with SAMR as it now is, but MOFCOM as it has been until recently, just because of the hierarchy and the structures and what you've just been touching on and the need to speak to other government agencies in different sectors. So in my experience, there are times when some of the work I'm trying to help the process is not actually with SAMR, but it's using some sort of, you might almost call it lobbying with the Ministry of Agriculture, wherever it might be, so that they understand the case and then input into the case. So it's a rather different way of going about helping the authority understand what the issues are than we're used to in Europe or the US or Brazil. That's a bit of an introduction. And there's a couple of points I've got. One is on monitoring trustees, and the other is on, well, if you look at the ways in which authorities can cooperate, it's not just case by case, it's also in different forums where regulators can meet and discuss, and a very important one is the ICN, for example, and CAJE plays an important role there, European Commission, DOJ and FTC. But the Chinese competition agencies do not participate in the ICN. There's a reason for that, but I might let Cunzhen explain what that is, because it's a little bit sensitive, I suspect. So I'd be interested to hear what you have to say about scope for involving MOFCOM, or SAMR rather, in cooperation outside individual cases. And the other one is, this is a much more specific question on remedies. In Brazil, in Europe, we're very used to appointing a monitoring trustee. I think the Brazilian process is very similar to the way we do it in Europe, where you go out and find some trustees who you think will be good for the job, and you propose one or maybe two trustees, and if the Commission's happy with them, then you get on with it fairly quickly. Whereas in my experience, unless things have changed in China, they come about it in a very different way, and you have to put forward, I think, 3 names, and then they choose which one they want, and that can be a problem if they choose one which isn't the one that you are wanting to use elsewhere. I've had cases where I've ended up with 3 different trustees on one case, which was fine, but you have to coordinate the trustees as well as coordinate the authorities. So any observations you've got on those 2 points, I'd be interested.
Thank you, John. First of all, about the Government Trade Association, indeed, John, your observation is very correct. A lot of work has to be done with government agencies. For example, in terms of semiconductor, that would be with Ministry of Industry and Information Technology, MIT. In terms of entertainment, it has to involve even more government agencies, including the Film Bureau, the CPC, Chinese Communist Party's propaganda department, etc. In terms of agriculture, it would be Ministry of Agriculture. Besides this, and besides Chinese competitors, Chinese customers, Chinese suppliers, there are another important stakeholders who are trade associations. So they can take a very essential role in making your life difficult. A lot of trade associations, because of historical reasons in China, are having Chinese government background or even current existing connections. So they would have to be taken care of as well. And we do not only use law firms. So as lawyers, we are helping with, for example, crafting messages the companies can deliver to these stakeholders. But as John said, we would have to hire some lobbying efforts, including internationally renowned JR firms, or if the company has very good on-the-ground Chinese JR team, internally, they should definitely be involved. And then there is some coordination between legal team and GR team as well. Sometimes that could spark some issues. So it's a little bit more complicated and involving more work streams on that front. And then ICN, it's quite sensitive. I would have to say because of some China-related territory has a position in ICN with a name that Beijing government does not really like. So Beijing government decides not to officially participate in ICN, but I think they are observer. They have the status observer. But I do think SMR, MOFCOM, at NDRC, as I said in the past, joined more meetings at OECD. Although we are not a member of OECD, but they are going to Paris for some interesting meetings over there as observer. Also with FTC and DOJ, as well as European Commission, the general training assistant capacity building efforts have been there for years. With European Commission, it started with MOFCOM back to 2004. And nowadays, they have like twice a year competition training weeks in China for Chinese authorities, including local agencies. And they also have this kind of coordination with US, but started much later. I think started in 2011 or 12. They have, again, twice every year dialogues between the two jurisdictions, but the dialogue is a little bit less structured than the dialogue between China and EU. In the US, it's more like a visit to DC and to China. There will be speeches, seminars. I think it's moving towards my structured way as well. And then for the third question, the monetary trustee, it is indeed very frustrating, not only for monetary trustee, but also for the buyer for the divested assets. You, in theory, would have to propose 3 candidates for each, and MOFCOM, SMR can choose whatever they see fit. And for monetary trustee, we also have cases where there are different trustees in different jurisdictions because US and EU coordinate very well, has the same trustee, but China chose another one. And if the same case is gigantic, involving totally different business areas, then there might be more than 2 different trustees in China because they want a different trustee for different business areas. And more frustratingly, the trustees normally do not have the knowledge of Chinese law, and they sometimes even do not have the Chinese language capability. So monitoring trustee would be encouraged by MOFCOM to hire a local law firm in China to help them. So for trustees in China, you will have to pay extra costs that would be incurred with having the local law firm to help. Yes, and then post-transaction, we also have a lot of work to do, a lot of extra work streams compared to other jurisdictions in China, including coordinating between trustees. And also, sometimes coordinating the trustee monetary reports. And MOFCOM does not like you having direct communication with trustees, so all communication would have to be through MOFCOM, SMR, etc. And I think that is something I briefly touched up on during my general answering questions part, which is if you have upfront buyer that for global divestiture, you generally have the consent from US and FTC, you might want to put that forward with MOFCOM SMR for this reason as well, because in that case, SMR might not ask you to give 3 candidates because they know it's going to be that company. It doesn't make any sense for them to ask for another 2 actual candidates. If they ask, that might be indication that they might think about like Chinese buyer or something. This effort has been successful in some cases, but not in all cases. And in another case, we were involved. The upfront buyer was already, informally agreed in the EU. And although US didn't require upfront buyer, but it has coordinated with EU, so the buyer would be approved quickly after the main transaction was approved. Everybody knows that, without doubt. But China, with knowing that, still requires 3 buyer candidates, although they know we will go with only 1 buyer.
Muito obrigado, Cunzhen. Passo a palavra para a Silvia para continuar com as perguntas.
Obrigada. Pelo visto, a discussão de remédios não é uma questão relevante só aqui no Brasil. Mas eu queria agora migrar um pouco para outro assunto muito importante, tem ganhado importância aqui no Brasil, que é a discussão de efeitos conglomerados. Eu queria fazer uma pergunta para o John Boyce, que é sócio do Slaughter & May e fica baseado em Bruxelas. Então, John, considerando a experiência europeia, eu gostaria de entender um pouco melhor, na sua perspectiva, quais são os elementos que poderiam ser levados em consideração pelas autoridades antitrust para barrar uma operação baseada em efeitos conglomerados?
Yeah, thank you. I attended a session yesterday. Some of you have been there that Eleonora was on, and she had some great slides there. So I'm rather hoping that she'll butt in and make some observations as well on this one. But I quite like to be a bit controversial sometimes. So let's see if I can get her to react a bit more. Conglomerate effects. Well, I mean, the whole word conglomerate it sort of means sort of a big business of some sort, and I think it's associated when people use it with conglomerates are big and bad, and you need to do something about them and break them up. So there is that sort of prejudice that comes from the use of the word in the first place. But if you look at the way conglomerate mergers, pure conglomerate mergers, are normally looked at in Europe, they can benefit from the simplified procedure because it's got no horizontal overlap, no vertical links at all. So most conglomerate mergers should be cleared very quickly by the European Commission. But there are cases where they feel, even though it might benefit from the simplified form, you'll say, no, we want you to put in a full form because there are issues that we want to explore. And where does the Commission get that sort of gut feeling that there's something wrong with this particular deal? In the early days when the European Commission was taking sort of baby steps on how to deal with conglomerate mergers, I think it really was just that old-fashioned prejudice against big, bad businesses. There was, the first time I came across the conglomerate theory was about 20 years ago when a client who did a fair bit of work for then, called Gillette, acquired Duracell. And the merger task force, as it was then, the part of the DG Comp, which was, or DG4 as it was then, they started raising questions. We put in a notification, a full notification, because we didn't have a simplified form, saying there are no issues. And at the sort of state of play meeting, they raised concerns about the conglomerate effects of bringing together two big businesses who are very important for supermarkets. And if you look at razor blades and batteries, you'll often see them sold at the checkout when you're walking out at the checkout. So this would be an opportunity for this business to dominate the supermarket checkout. That was the sort of theory. And we just, the American client, you can imagine the reaction. So we sort of just said, this is nonsense, it doesn't make any sense whatsoever. And we had and we actually, I recall now, it's all coming back to me now, said, look, let's take out some time and could we just pull and refile and educate you about these things? And the head of the merger task force said, no, you can only withdraw a notification if it's incomplete, and we think your notification was complete. But we had a dialogue, and then at the end of the day, they concluded that they couldn't see much scope for bringing the two products together. I mean, who could imagine, for example, of having a razor blade that you put a battery in? But a few years later, Gillette did do a razor blade with a battery in it, and if you buy one of those and open up, you'll find it's a Duracell battery inside. So there you are. There's an opportunity for tying products there, but we didn't quite get there. But if the Commission was looking at those issues now, they would be applying the guidelines that they've got. And I think the cases where the Commission do intervene and raises issues, a lot of them are where there's someone complaining about it and raising concerns. So they're coming with, I think these are issues that you should look at, and in my experience, and in fact it's backed up by the slides that I saw yesterday, that in most cases where the Commission looks at it because of a complaint, let's say, they end up dismissing the concerns. The other area, though, where I think this biggest bad thing is still alive and works is in big data and tech sectors, where there is that sort of fear of the unknown. If you bring together two businesses, particularly if one's called Google or Apple, with a smaller player, you might be distorting the way in which the relevant market might develop in future. Who knows what that small player might do? Maybe if they'd been allowed to be independent for another 5 years, they would be a big global rival to Google or Amazon or whatever it might be, but the FANGs, as they call them. So that is, as a result, I think the sort of area where the Commission will explore further whether there is something that needs to be done. But to their credit again, I think the Commission recognises that conglomerate mergers generally bring efficiencies, because you're able, if you're selling, you can cut out the middleman if you've got issues of bundling products together, and that may be more cost effective for a purchaser. I heard an analogy, if you're buying, imagine if you had to buy a car and you had to buy the wheels and the engine and the steering wheel from different buyers, you'd end up paying a lot more for it. So bundling products together can make sense. That's a sort of my general observation on where they will use it. But if there is to be a remedy, that's the area where they will look more at behavioural remedies of some sort, rather than structural remedies which could destroy the rationale for the deal or remove some of the efficiencies. One of the first cases I faced under the new approach was when Intel acquired McAfee. So that was combining computer chips with a security software business. And the Commission explored the possibility that Intel with McAfee could supply computers with chips which would be able to prevent viruses coming into the computer. So it's a nice theory about bundling things together, but it was seen as a positive thing to do, but it could have a foreclosure effect on other security software suppliers. And on that particular case, they had a strong complaint from one of McAfee's competitors, who was actually a bigger player than McAfee in that space. So that sort of fits in with my sort of model of the Commission will look at cases where there are complaints in particular, and where they've got concerns about how a market might develop in the future. And if they do think there are concerns, they'll try and address them, as they did in that case, with behavioural commitments. And my recollection of that case was we agreed some simple behavioural commitments, which the Commission was happy with at the case team level. And then, I'd never had this before or since, the Chief Economist team intervened and said, no, we're concerned that those commitments are potentially too strong. And they watered them down a bit because they didn't want the efficiencies of the merger to be destroyed.
Ok, obrigada. E nesses casos...
No. Since I was provoked, I may say. I mean, it's all very true, and I agree on all. And actually, now our guidelines, the one from 2007, recognize as a main principle that conglomerate mergers can actually bring efficiencies, and so have to be looked at. One thing that, though, we don't have to forget is that. In the guidelines, the main effect, possible anti-competitive effects of conglomerate mergers identified in foreclosure, but there is not only that, and there are also possible exploitative conducts, and I guess the issue of the Gillette it was more because increased bargaining power of the merged entity post-transaction could also have cause a problem. So I'm not familiar very much with the case, but I guess that the triggers of harm was that if you increase your bargaining power vis-a-vis retailers, you can get a more prominent space in this very specific, let's say, location of the supermarket, and then be able to have, more visibility. And this was a trigger of harm that it's not something we looked only in the past, but even very recently in Qualcomm and XP respect to patents. And in this case, actually, we had, for something which was also considered as conglomerate, a structural remedy for this bit, which was a reverse carve-out, which is something that normally we don't like, but in this specific context, we had so also in the case of conglomerate mergers, for example, the specific type of theory of harm, we can have structural remedies. So do not think that in conglomerate we only accept behavior.
If I can come back with another little anecdote, again, it's all coming back to me now, but Gillette and Duracell, they got together, but then a few years later, I did a lot of work for them, Gillette, over the years, but a few years later, I was harmed by a merger because Procter & Gamble came along and bought Gillette. And after that, because we had another client, Unilever, who would not agree to our acting for anyone owned by their big rival, Procter & Gamble, I stopped working for them. It's a great shame. So I was harmed by that merger. But when the Commission looked at that merger, they looked at, and we knew they were going to look at it more at those exact concerns about the power in the supermarket, but concluded that really there were no areas really where the larger Procter & Gamble would be able to call the shots and essentially have must-stock brands of a type which would enable them to force supermarkets to take a broader range. So they did a proper analysis to their credit, but as I say, I lost a client as a result.
Bom, muito obrigada, John. Muito obrigada, Eleonora. Passar a palavra para o Francisco.
Agora vamos fazer algumas perguntas para o Hartman Schneider, do Wilmer Hale. Hartman, algumas vezes as agências dos Estados Unidos têm aplicado o modelo de fechamento de capacidade, né, em operações envolvendo mercados de produtos homogêneos, com elevados custos fixos, como papéis e produtos químicos. Acho que a primeira pergunta seria o que é exatamente esse modelo, como ele tem sido aplicado e quais são os desenvolvimentos recentes envolvendo esse modelo.
Thank you, Francisco. Capacity closure is one of these theories or one of these techniques that is fairly deep in the economic toolkit, but when it comes out, it can really hurt. And there's been a recent development in a matter that I think is actually interesting from a couple of perspectives because it provides a reflection on international cooperation and what that means for the merger review. It presented a very unusual procedural question, and then it had this capacity closure issue. The matter is Tronox Crystal. It was a merger between two manufacturers of titanium dioxide, which is a chemical used in, I think, brightening paint, for example. The parties were the number, I think, 2 and 3 in the market, had 15 and 20% roughly, so 35% combined market share. The kind of situation where when you look at the market shares and at the HHIs, you can sort of see that there might be a problem, but it's a little difficult to see that there should be a unilateral effects problem, maybe coordinated effects, but unilateral effects not that clear. So that was the transaction. Perhaps briefly procedurally, because we spoke about the European perspective, the Federal Trade Commission in December 2017 decided to challenge that merger. And because of a quirk in the way the FTC enforcement system works relative to the Department of Justice enforcement system. The FTC brought a challenge in what we call Part 3, which is an administrative litigation process at the Federal Trade Commission. Virtually always when that happens, the Federal Trade Commission also files a motion for a preliminary injunction in federal court because, as most of you probably know, and much unlike the European process and the Brazilian process as I understand it, is neither the FTC nor the DOJ can actually block a merger. They have to go to court and get it prohibited. So the FTC filed suit brought a complaint in the administrative review proceeding, but did not simultaneously seek a preliminary injunction. And the reason for that at the time was that the European Commission was still working on the matter, so there was a suspension obligation still pending in Europe. And so from the FTC's official position at least was they wouldn't have been able to bring a preliminary injunction because there was no essentially imminent threat of the transaction being closed. That litigation continued for a while, the Part 3 litigation continued for a while, and then the European Commission, something like 6 months later, I think in July, cleared the deal with remedies in Europe, and suddenly the parties were free to close, and the FTC walked into federal court and sought a preliminary injunction, which then was granted. And so there was a lot of complaints by the parties that because of the FTC's decision not to bring the preliminary injunction in the first place, there was a lot of delay. They had to go through the entire Part 3 process, and then they had to sort of relitigate the case in federal court. And if the FTC had brought the preliminary injunction in the first place, things could have gone more quickly. There's a bit of a question whether, like I said, the preliminary injunction was available at the time, but it sort of illustrates the unusual procedural posture and also the impact that international parallel reviews can have on this. So, what was the substantive question in the case, or how did the Federal Trade Commission approach it? The issue here was one of the questions that was raised was, after the transaction, would it be profitable for the combined company, for Tronox Crystal, to reduce titanium dioxide capacity in an effort to increase price in the market and then benefit from it because its margin on the remaining sales were higher? And it's long been recognized that that is a potential theory of harm, but it wasn't until sort of the late 2000s that initially the Department of Justice came up with a theory about a model about how to actually measure that, and that's the capacity closure model. What the capacity closure model does is it looks to see what are the benefits of an output reduction approach, and the benefits are, as I said, potentially a higher margin on the remaining sales. And what are the costs, on the other hand? And the costs are the lost sales as a result of the output reduction. And then you compare the two. All sounds easy, but you compare the two, and if there's a benefit from output reduction, there's potentially harm. This is sort of about as much as the lawyers can contribute to this. When this happens in practice, it's typically you sort of get on the phone with the agency economists and your own economists, and then you make introductions and sit back for an hour and listen to what they do. But that is essentially how this has worked, and the FTC in that case, among other theories, was able to convince at least the federal judge in the preliminary injunction hearings that there was enough of a case on the capacity closure that was a problem, and one of the reasons why the transaction ultimately, why the preliminary injunction was granted. Now, why is this relevant, other than for those of us who enjoy the economics of that? I think it's relevant because this comes up. If it comes up in homogeneous product industries where there are high fixed costs, typically. And in those industries, it comes up in situations where, as I said at the beginning, you might find a market structure that doesn't immediately scream that there would be unilateral effects, where you might have a party with 35, 36, something like that, % of the market, significant other competitors, and you wouldn't immediately think that necessarily there might be unilateral effects. It continues to be an approach that the agencies use in those cases, and certainly something that, from the U.S. perspective, it is worth continuing to keep an eye out for.
Muito obrigado. De forma a permitir já, desde logo, a contribuição e a participação de quem está aqui conosco, a gente perguntaria e abriria já para algumas perguntas para os palestrantes que já falaram até o momento. Eu vou esperar mais um pouco. Bom, Hartmann, eu tenho então mais uma pergunta. Os Estados Unidos eles estão na vanguarda das discussões sobre potenciais efeitos anticompetitivos de cross-shareholdings, de participações cruzadas, né? Quais as questões mais recentes que têm sido debatidas nos Estados Unidos? Quais as lições que nós podemos extrair delas, especialmente olhando para o futuro e para as próximas tendências envolvendo esse tema que é tão importante?
Yeah, so thank you. So cross-shareholdings, so what we mean by that is an investor holding minority shareholdings in different competing companies. It's been a very hot topic for a while, especially, I would say, during the tail end of the Obama administration, with a lot of academic studies being done on that. It's probably been a little quieter since. Not 100% clear to me whether that's just because maybe there haven't been as many cases. Certainly there's been a lot of attention being paid to other issues, perhaps also because there's a greater skepticism about some of the underlying economics. But roughly, what are the kinds of issues that are presented by cross-shareholdings? I would say there are broadly 3 questions, 2 of which are relatively straightforward, and the third one is the one where most of the debate's taking place, certainly in the U.S. First question is sort of the straightforward: does that give the investor direct influence over the 2 parties? That's an issue that's been around for a long time. There have been enforcement actions in the past. It's also relatively easy to deal with in the concrete setting, because transactions can be structured in a way to allow that or to avoid that. The second question, again, relatively straightforward, I think, is information spillover from one of the companies through the joint investors back over to the other party. And there again, not a new topic really, a topic that can be dealt with typically through information firewalls, putting different people on boards and things like that. The third element the third theory that's been discussed in the literature a fair amount is, apart from these first 2 questions, does joint shareholding affect the incentives of the managers of the 2 firms? And so the theory is if I'm in charge of sales at one of these 2 companies, and I know that I have a 20% investor who's also invested in one of my major competitors, would I have an incentive then to pull my competitive punches, because I know if I hurt the other competitor in the marketplace, it's indirectly going to hurt my investor potentially, and would I have an incentive to do that? A lot of papers being written about that, a lot of skepticism expressed in part because the managers who make those decisions typically don't get paid on the basis of split interests by their investors. They get paid on the basis of how many sales they make, and so their incentives may not necessarily be aligned with what this theory posits. But it's been a topic of a fair amount of discussion. We haven't had any enforcement cases specifically on that third theory that I'm aware of. It's been a question that, if you have investigations, comes up occasionally. but we're kind of still looking for whether there is progress. I mean, my general sense on sort of if I had to make the priority list of what's high on the list of priorities of the current leadership at the DOJ and FTC, I would probably say this topic was downgraded a bit relative to where it was a few years ago, but I don't think it's dropped off that list yet.
Rafique, you would have a comment?
Yeah, just to give the European perspective to this, I mean, the European Commission spent quite a lot of time thinking about changing the rules to be able to capture minority shareholdings, and where it came out eventually is to say it's too burdensome and it's not justified, as it were, because the theory that these shareholdings could cause harm is just too remote. That being said, the issue of cross-shareholdings is something we come up against in practice in cases of suitability of purchases and remedies. So you'll find the Commission does ask multiple questions about the independence of the buyer from the merging parties to be able to compete with emerging parties, which is logical. I think we are seeing more and more lots of questions about, well, what shareholdings do they have, and does a 2 to 3 to 4% shareholding actually matter in these big listed companies? I'm more in the camp of being skeptical about this, but maybe I'll just look across and see whether we get a reaction from the Commission.
Well, actually, I will surprise you, because on this tier of arm that you were mentioning, we actually had an enforcement case last year. So we had the case where Telecom operator, so Telecom Italia, Vivendi was acquiring Telecom Italia. Vivendi is a media group, and Telecom Italia is active in the telecom sector mainly, let's say. And however, Vivendi had also, through Vivendi, through the acquisition, would have had a stake, minority stake, in a competitors in a market very specific. I don't go into details because there are these telecom markets, actually use a TV to infrastructure level, quite complex, but there was a minority shareholding there, and we found that actually as a result of the transaction, despite this minority shareholding didn't confer any control or right in the behavior of the other competitor, what Vivendi could have done would have been to basically reduce the competitive pressure that the companies that it was acquiring was exerting on the other competitor in the market, so that at the end it could have recaptured the sale maybe lost through his, let's say, minority shareholding in the other company. So it was something that we look at very carefully, and so this shows that our attention in the context of remedy, it's maybe well placed, because we could have issues also in that respect.
Muito obrigado, Hartmann, Rafique, Eleonora. Passo para a Silvia para a gente continuar com as perguntas.
Bom, acho que a gente discutiu bastante questões relacionadas a fusões e aquisições, a atos de concentração. Passo agora a discutir um pouco questões relacionadas a cartel. Eu queria endereçar agora uma pergunta para Charles Rick Rowe, do Paul, Weiss, Rifkind, Wharton e Garrison. Well, Rick, nos casos de cartéis globais, considerando a proliferação de jurisdições que sancionam os mesmos cartéis, haveria razões para nos preocuparmos com over-deterrence frente às multas advindas de várias jurisdições ao mesmo tempo?
Thank you. This is a question and an issue that, frankly, doesn't get much discussion in gatherings like this. It used to in the 1980s. And what I'm about to say, and my answer is, may seem a little heretical to this audience, but just to give you a little bit of background, I ran the antitrust division in the late 80s, and back in those days we focused a lot on cartel enforcement and criminal enforcement, and in fact I hold the record for bringing more criminal cases than anybody at the antitrust division before or since. And in the 80s I spent a lot of time going around to international groups, OECD in particular, arguing that well, first off, defending the U.S. Position on criminal enforcement against cartels. We were accused of being of extending our jurisdiction too far and of not being adequately aware and sympathetic to the needs of business people. So I had to defend against that, but also I spent a fair amount of time, as did others at the time in the department, in arguing to other jurisdictions that they ought to take cartel enforcement seriously, because at that point, for example, in Europe, the principal attention cartels got in Europe was exemptions under from the Commission. And I still remember giving a speech and delivering a paper at OECD that basically touted the virtues of cartel enforcement. But, you know, in looking back on it, I think sometimes you regret the things you hope for. After I left and in the 90s, obviously the attitude towards cartels changed dramatically. Jurisdiction after jurisdiction brought cartel regimes to the front. Some were criminal. I mean, for example, the UK adopted a criminal sanction. The EU is not truly criminal, but if you look at the fines there and some other administrative or civil jurisdictions, they can be as onerous as criminal fines in the United States. And in addition, as we heard yesterday, and as you well know, increasingly jurisdictions are considering adding on top of those sort of sanctions private actions, mimicking the U.S. concern or treble damage approach, or at least damages, which all raises the fact that, well, you know, at some point you're going to over-deter conduct. The reason in the 80s that we were not terribly concerned about it was, one, we felt that there were a lot of cartels that went outside the United States and that imposed significant injury that wasn't addressed. Two, at the time, the Department of Justice focused just on per se violations. We had some discussion of this yesterday. Without going into great detail as to why we focus on per se violations, the United States doesn't have to. It could actually prosecute criminally rule of reason violations. There'd be some difficulty because you have to prove a violation beyond a reasonable doubt. But the other reason was, historically, has been that by narrowing the focus of cartel enforcement to agreements that are truly anti-competitive and have no redeeming benefits, you don't run the risk of over-deterrence. So that sort of narrow focus is very important and critical to avoiding over-deterrence. And the final point that led us to be less concerned is, even though people were at the time concerned in the United States about treble damages and whether that created over-deterrence, the fact is that fines were a lot lower at that point, and it's also true that the targets of our criminal enforcement tended to be smaller cartels. In the interim, several things have happened. For example, fines have gone up. As I said, they proliferated around the world. You have multiple jurisdictions going after the same cartel. And in many cases, I can give you one example, is capacitors, which has been attacked by a number of different jurisdictions. And different jurisdictions are actually imposing fines on the very same sales. So you get very large fines on the exact same sales. And then you have a further problem, which is that as cartel enforcement has proliferated to jurisdictions like Europe and maybe Brazil and others, where they don't have that narrow focus on per se violations, where, for example, the cartel enforcement can be against information exchanges or infringements by object, where it's not so clear that there aren't potentially redeeming values to that conduct. And the result, I think, is, but again, it's a little early days because this, even though it seems like a long time, has transpired over 25 to 30 years. So, and in some places like Asia, it's really a phenomenon of the last 10 years. So it's hard to know whether it's had over-deterrent effect. But I think one piece of evidence that I think is worthy of being concerned is the fact that it is now viewed among the business community as much higher risk to be involved in trade associations than it was, 30 years ago. And a lot of the things that trade associations do are actually beneficial and can be helpful in terms of generating pro-competitive information in the marketplace. And to the extent that companies find it too risky to join because they may potentially be ensnared in some international cartel investigation, that would be a bad thing. And so in my view, at this point, it's probably worthwhile people worrying, who are in your position, worrying about the adverse or interorum effect of too many jurisdictions applying too many fines and too many damages to the same conduct.
Ok, obrigada.
Agora vamos passar para o Rafique, do Freshfields, para continuar ainda na discussão de cartéis e o combate aos cartéis, né? Os instrumentos de leniência e de acordos no combate aos cartéis, eles têm se mostrado muito bem sucedidos na União Europeia, né? E imagina-se que enquanto os benefícios que continuem muito claros, tanto do ponto de vista da autoridade, como também dos investigados, esperaríamos que esse caminho continuasse sendo um caminho bem sucedido. Você vê algum risco para a continuada utilização bem sucedida desses instrumentos no futuro?
Thank you. Maybe just to set the scene a little bit in terms of what options are available for a European company that has discovered a cartel. Essentially, I break them down into three. The first is consider immunity and leniency, /leniency, and I'll explain what that is in 2 minutes. The other one is consider the tool of settlement, which is a little bit different, and I'll explain that. And third, consider converting yourself as an ostrich, put the head in the sand and hope for the best. So those are the kind of discussions that you need to have with clients, obviously, in these scenarios. In terms of immunity and leniency, we've got a well-established regime that's been used for quite a number of years, and I would struggle to think of a case where there hasn't been a leniency applicant, at least in Europe, because it's used quite heavily, and it's a very effective tool, or has been a very effective tool for the European Commission to prosecute cartels. And it's pretty simple. The first in gets 100% reduction of fines. We don't have a criminal element here at EU level. I'm just talking at EU level, not at a national member state level. Second in can get up to 50% and so on and so forth, depending on the value of the evidence that they present. I think a lot has been talked about the interaction between the leniency immunity regime on the one hand and cartel damages claims on the other. And there's been a lot of work done by the European Commission that led eventually to the damages directive, which essentially is a signal or a request to all member states to adopt and amend their national laws to be able to facilitate damages being brought in national courts, because that's where it has to be brought. It can't be brought at EU level. Even before the damages directive was up and running, we saw a lot of claims being brought, particularly in the UK, in Germany, Netherlands, France to a certain extent, the vast majority of which I can say were settled commercially out of court because nobody wanted the hassle of being stuck in court for a number of years. And it was quite a successful process, but now we've taken it to the next level of being able to bring these claims in the vast majority of EU member states. I think there are just one or two that haven't yet implemented the directive and are a bit late, but we're getting there. I think there is a tension, obviously, between leniency and the decision of whether to go in for leniency, and thinking not only of the heavy fines that you're going to face, but also of the implications in terms of cartel damages. in particular if the cartel has not been discovered. So that is weighing very heavily on the minds of management, a GC, a board, in taking that decision. But maybe I'll park that a little bit and talk, because we've covered this topic, I think, here and in other sessions, and talk a little bit more about the settlement regime. And what we mean by settlement is, it's a relatively new tool that we have in Europe. It started in effectively in 2010, when the first case was settled. And it's essentially a tool to lessen the burden on the Commission to go through the whole process of writing a very detailed statement of objections, going through an oral hearing, providing full access to file, and it ends up with the party who's agreed to settle obtaining an additional 10% fine reduction. And I say additional because it can be on top of a leniency reduction, and obtaining a much shorter decision, which is typically about 29 pages, the vast majority of which is talking about the process, and it doesn't contain much evidence, which is quite beneficial for follow-on claims, of course. Now, I think it's fair to say that settlement has been a successful tool. I've got some stats here, which I just dug out this morning. In 2010, 29% of cases were settled. 2016, 50%, and 2017, 40%. So if you look at the cartel cases between 2010 and 2017, there were 46 of them, and 52% of them went through a settlement process. So I think it's fair to say that it is a successful tool, and I'm sure the Commission would agree with me on that. There is a little wrinkle to settlements, which is what we call the hybrid settlement cases. So settlement is ideally, I would say, designed for cases where, say, you've got 5 cartelists, the 5 go in and say, we're willing to settle. And then you reap the benefits of the whole process of a much shorter process, less burdensome, and all the benefits are there. But there are cases where you've got some parties willing to settle, others say, no, actually, we're not convinced, we want to fight. Even though this doesn't, I mean, it does involve an admission of guilt, which is obviously a drawback. The Commission has been brave enough to say, yes, we're going to go ahead with hybrid settlement cases, and there are a number of hybrid settlement cases out there, where the Commission said, well, fine, those who are willing to settle will benefit from the 10% reduction, will get the shorter decision, and those who don't, fine, we'll just run with the normal process. The slight wrinkle that we've had, and that takes us to the risk part, is there was a case earlier this year, which is called the ICAP case, where there was a challenge on this hybrid settlement process in front of the court in Luxembourg. And the issue that was brought was a rights of defense type argument, which is if you've got a 5-party cartel and 4 agreed to settle and 1 didn't, if the settlement decision is adopted prior to the non-settlement decision being adopted, by definition, the settlement decision has implicated the party not willing to settle, who has not fully exercised his or her rights of defense, but has found them effectively guilty because, without necessarily explicitly saying that, but they're all over the settlement decision. And there was a challenge to that. Where does that take us in terms of potential success of the settlement in hybrid cases? Personally, I don't think it means the whole system is jeopardized in any shape or form. I think there is an approach where this could still work. And I would draw a distinction between 2 different systems here, one which we call the staggered approach in hybrids. Staggered approach is one where the Commission accelerates the settlement process, issues a settlement decision, and then runs with the normal process after that and issues the full decision. But that's when you fall into the trap of rights of defense being fully exercised. The other approach, which I think can be the solution, and we haven't had any decisions yet which go down this route, but it's the synchronized approach, to say, I will reach a settlement decision with those parties willing to settle, I will sit on that decision, I will continue with the normal process until I reach a decision on the normal process, and I'll adopt both the decisions simultaneously. But bearing in mind that there needs to be caution in terms of the outcome of the 2 decisions. I mean, the worst scenario could be that those who fought get a better benefit than those who didn't. So you can't have a settlement decision, in my view, where the settling party is worse off than a non-settling party, putting aside the 10%. So I think these are the kind of debates that we're having currently in Europe.
Muito interessante e interessante para traçar paralelos com o Brasil também. A gente tem algumas perguntas, acho que a gente pode falar com a Rachel e depois seguir para as perguntas. Nós vamos passar agora para a nossa última convidada, a Rachel, e em seguida a gente já abre completamente para perguntas.
Bom, olá, Rachel. Rachel Brass, do Gibson Dan. Rachel, o CAD tem procurado incluir nas investigações de cartel tanto pessoas físicas quanto pessoas jurídicas, mesmo em cartéis internacionais. Você teve a chance de participar de algumas dessas investigações. Queria saber um pouco da sua experiência, como é que foi, qual que é a sua percepção sobre o CAD incluir, especialmente as pessoas físicas, nesse tipo de investigação.
So I think it is appropriate to include individuals in these types of investigations, but I would submit that there could be changes to how individuals are addressed that would more fairly encompass those who have a significant role or responsibility in the violation and that are tied more closely to culpability, particularly in connection with an actual effect in Brazil. I will say this is an area where I think in U.S. enforcement we have had improvements over the last 5 years. Historically, individuals who face potential prosecution were named individually in company plea agreements. In 2013, the Department of Justice ended that practice because it created a permanent tarnish on one's reputation, where ultimately the Department of Justice may have elected that they had insufficient evidence or you lacked sufficient culpability to face prosecution, but all the same had the permanent tarnish on your reputation. To the extent that where individuals are identified in cases here, they are identified in connection with their role or responsibility. That is not clearly communicated to the individuals who are targets of the investigation. And in my own experience representing companies and individuals, I would respectfully submit that there are certain people who have been identified where there is no possible plausible argument that they either had a role in decision-making, a role in pricing, or any actual culpability. It simply was a fact that their name appeared on a document somewhere in the files of a competitor company. But all the same, their name was aired publicly, it was published in the press, and this is not resolved simply by the matter that ultimately the investigation against them was shelved. Instead results in a second round of negative publicity where they are identified in connection with the shelving. So this is an area I think both perhaps for domestic individuals, but certainly for foreign individuals who have no ability to come and defend their name without incredible expense and subjecting themselves to the jurisdiction of a foreign sovereign that may not otherwise have jurisdiction unless they come and attempt to defend themselves, that greater care should be taken both with respect to publicity and with respect to identifying individuals who are in fact culpable for the violation.
Ok, obrigada. Ainda relacionado... Desculpa. Acho que tem mais algumas questões relacionadas a cartéis que seria interessante fazer para você. Agora, relacionadas a ações civis de reparação de danos, que também é um assunto bastante importante aqui no Brasil, teve um painel discutindo esse ponto. E teve um caso recente que, após decisões do CAD envolvendo CRT, CDT e CRT, CPT, muitas empresas brasileiras ajuizaram ações na Holanda contra diversos produtores asiáticos de CRT. Elas também tentaram ter acesso aos autos relacionados à investigação do CAD. Então, quais seriam as suas considerações que devem ser levadas na análise ao refletir sobre a possibilidade de empresas lesadas terem acesso a esse tipo de material do CAD no Brasil?
So I understand that CAD has released new guidelines in this regard, and I do think that it is helpful that there are guidelines. That's certainly a move in the right direction. but I do have some concerns about the scope of those guidelines. Insofar as it is not clear that companies that have cooperated with investigations will get notice that their materials may be provided. There are some concerns which may involve simply not a lack of clarity in translation, but about whether those guidelines will apply retroactively, where companies have made a decision to cooperate with an expectation of confidential treatment, but now face a retroactive risk of release to potential claimants. I also worry that they may create a disincentive for leniency to the extent that a lenient who has come forward and detailed their wrongdoing and provided significant cooperation will then face less favorable treatment than those who resist or fight investigations and follow-on civil litigation. But in this case in particular, I am the most concerned because it encourages forum shopping by civil litigants. And in that respect, I mean that the litigation has been brought in Europe through a European theory of jurisdiction related to anchor defendants, where in Europe they can use the existence of a decision by the European Commission to establish liability and the presence of a significant European defendant to establish jurisdiction over companies that may not otherwise face jurisdiction. And they've done so because the Netherlands is, in that regard, an easier place to bring litigation. But there is no question that the European Commission would not allow them access to documents in its files for the purpose of pursuing the litigation where those companies sought leniency or otherwise cooperated in the investigation. And so now you face a situation where they are going around the world and seeking the most favorable treatment from different jurisdictions to cobble together an approach that they could not take through bringing recourse in a single forum. And I think that creates an area where there is a lack of clarity, a lack of reliance on settled expectations, and an abuse of seeking benefits from multiple forums that's ultimately, I think, a disincentive for some of the more positive aspects of civil recourse that we're seeing developing.
Ok, muito obrigada. Acho que a gente teria mais questões para fazer, mas a audiência também trouxe alguns pontos. Queriam compartilhar algumas questões. Vou começar pelo Eduardo, que já levantou aqui a mão. Por favor.
Obrigado, Silvia. Eduardo Caminati Beno Advogados. Eu tenho uma pergunta que eu gostaria de endereçar ao Charles e ao Rafique. Recentemente, aqui no Brasil, no âmbito do combate a cartéis e no âmbito de negociações de acordos em caso de cartel, dois temas começam a ganhar alguma importância nessa discussão, que são over-deterrence e ability to pay. O Charles já falou um pouco sobre over-deterrence, mas eu gostaria de ouvir tanto do Charles quanto do Rafique qual o atual estágio da discussão de ability to pay em negociações em caso de cartel, tanto perante o DOJ quanto perante a European Commission, e quais seriam, obviamente, de linhas gerais, os principais pontos levados por cada uma dessas autoridades na discussão com as empresas sobre ability to pay.
Well, there is definitely a process in the United States for essentially having a company's fine reduced by the ability to pay. There's a process of essentially looking at the pleading party or the convicted defendant's ability to pay, having basically forensic accountants go in and look at how much money they need, what the impact of a fine is going to be, and then altering the fine as appropriate. You know, that could be, I mean, you know, it certainly is a way to ameliorate the impact on a particular defendant. When I was talking about over-deterrence, you know, it's sort of the concept that fines are not so much directed at the individual companies that engage in it. I mean, obviously they have to pay it because they're the ones who are responsible. But it's the interorum effect on everybody else out there to make sure that in the future they don't violate it. And my own personal view, and done, and I'm going to hand it over to Rafique, and perhaps he can address this. I think when Rafique mentioned, 3 different approaches that one can take in Europe, there's one that's missing. Now, I'm not saying that it's missing, that there's not a good reason to exclude it, but at least in the United States, it's an important line that a client needs to consider, and that is defending oneself. The fact is that one of the, in my opinion, adverse effects of increased fines and the proliferation of leniency and cooperation around the world is all too often clients are advised that you have no choice but to cooperate. And once you cooperate, once you start giving the government things that it otherwise couldn't get, and basically incriminating your client, because that's part of what happens with leniency, there's no way back, to be honest with you. And so at that point, to some extent, you're largely dependent on the good faith of the regulator that you're dealing with. And just practically what that means in the United States, for example, is you can go in and cooperate, you can think that you're going to get a great discount, but the government still controls how they view what is really critical to sentencing, which is the volume of affected commerce. And if you have no leverage in terms of affecting that calculation, you could get a 50% discount. That's great, but let's say the government overstates the volume of affected commerce by 20 times. So, my own view is you have to be careful in advising a client, because you're not doing the client a favor if you tell them you got to go in, you got to cooperate before you know all the facts, before you know where the government is going. And you're much better off, and frankly, we've had a lot more success in getting clients out entirely by waiting to see what happens, and recognizing that the government didn't have a case that they could prove in court. And if you can prove that, if you can show that to them, they won't sue your client. And ultimately, paying nothing with no discounts, a lot better deal than paying $100 million with a 50% discount.
I fully agree with that. I think and I would also add that it is important for regulators to look at leniency applications with a certain amount of skepticism as well, because some, and again, we've argued this quite successfully in front of the Commission, are somewhat self-serving, because they do go too far sometimes in an effort to obtain the benefit that they're trying to achieve out of immunity application or leniency application. But when you really dig down into the evidence, you see that there's a lot of hearsay and there's not enough solid evidence to support what's in the leniency application. And I've had that in 2 cases where, again, we fought, we criticized the evidence, and eventually we were dropped from the investigation. And absolutely, that is a very valid strategy in some cases. On inability to pay, John just whispered a cheeky comment in my ear to say he can't imagine that Freshfields works for anybody who can't pay. So my practical experience here is rather limited. That being said, in the EU as well, there is a system, there is an approach to go to the Commission to argue inability to pay. The issue that we see typically is, and going back to the conglomerate versus one product company type approach, you find a company that's a one product company that's been cartelized is being really punished quite a lot in a fine compared to a conglomerate, where conglomerate's producing tens and hundreds of various products, and at the end of the day, the fine is based on the sales. So you do find cases, particularly with one product companies, where they do suffer. The process involves a forensic accounting process where you need to go to the Commission, engage with the Commission, and actually prove to them that this is going to take the company down, which is not good for competition at the end of the day. Not that a cartel is, but it's not very common for companies to win. As I said, no personal experience there. But the process is there. Yeah.
Gustavo.
Bom dia, Gustavo Madi, LCA Consultores. Minha pergunta foge um pouco do núcleo central do antitrust, mas conversa com uma mesa que a gente fez ontem, que era sobre a relação entre defesa da concorrência e defesa comercial. Isso está no âmbito de uma discussão nossa aqui no Brasil, que é colocar a autoridade concorrencial para ajudar ou para participar de questões relativas à defesa comercial. Um tipo de mistura que não é tão comum de ver no mundo, embora na Comissão Europeia, por exemplo, tenha lá uma área de state aid, que é, de alguma forma, uma conexão entre concorrência e tributário. Aí a minha pergunta para a mesa, para quem puder comentar, é se existe essa discussão também em outras jurisdições, se vocês já passaram por isso, de fazer a autoridade concorrencial participar mais de decisões de outras esferas, especificamente defesa comercial e tributário.
Última pergunta.
Let me just take briefly this. There are several different aspects to your question. In the United States, one of the things the Antitrust Division and the FTC do is participate in regulatory proceedings in front of other agencies. And they are known as sort of the competition, advocate in various of those places, and they will also sometimes get involved when states consider that. With respect to considering sort of non-competition issues in mergers or other enforcement policies, which is the sort of opposite side of that coin, that's a pretty hot topic in the United States now. The FTC is holding some hearings to decide whether or not the appropriate approach to antitrust should be broadened to consider things. And so things like impacts on labor market are one of the things that folks are starting to think about in terms of merger enforcement. On the other hand, the sort of hot topic and thing that I think a lot of people around the world look at the United States about is what we would call CFIUS, or national security reviews in transactions. And I'm sure you've noticed that the United States tends to be more restrictive today about inbound investments from certain countries. We've actually expanded our law to limit those sort of inbound investments when sensitive technologies are involved. But that takes place in a committee called CFIUS, the Committee for Foreign Investment in the United States. It used to be, back in my day, that committee, the Antitrust Division sat on that committee and sort of brought the antitrust perspective to it. But in the intervening years, they created a new division, the National Security Division, that sits on it that has a very different perspective, very much a national security protection perspective. And so right now, those two regimes are kind of run very separately and in parallel, but they both can be very relevant to a particular transaction.
Are you wanting a comment from Europe?
From Europe,
yeah,
if possible.
Well, you have to remember that the application of competition rules to tax is the application of the state aid rules, which are pretty unique to the European Union, and those rules are directed at the member states. If you want to be a member of the European Union, a country wants to be a member, it needs to ensure that it behaves in a way that doesn't distort competition through granting state aid. So if you were to attract an American company to set up in your jurisdiction by giving them cash subsidies, that would be distorting where the American company might have established itself if it didn't have that incentive, and could mean that other member states would be unfairly disadvantaged. And tax, the Commission has sort of stretched that to look at tax regimes, because you can have a very favourable tax regime which could have that effect. But you have to remember that the rules are addressed to the member state, and then if the Commission does find that a member state has infringed, the member state is required to recover the money that it gave illegally from the recipient of the aid. It is not the Commission imposing a fine on the company itself. I don't know if that helps.
Bom, muito obrigado. Antes de passar para a nossa última pergunta, eu gostaria só de fazer um especial agradecimento ao Gustavo por 2 motivos. Primeiro, pela excelente pergunta envolvendo, né, defesa comercial e direito da concorrência. Segundo, porque você auxilia a quebrar o monopólio do qual eu fui acusado ontem, ao final do dia, de ter monopolizado as perguntas sobre o tema. Então, agora, tivemos mais perguntas de outro interlocutor sobre o tema aqui no seminário. Carolina.
Bom, bom dia, eu sou Carolina Saito, servidora do Tribunal do CAD. A minha pergunta vai mais para os advogados da mesa. É muito importante que a gente tenha pessoas de vários lugares relacionadas a operações que envolvam mercados tecnológicos e como a gente cada dia tem enfrentado desafios sobre a questão de dinâmica e os efeitos que os mercados podem acontecer, se isso mudou um pouco a análise de vocês sobre quais jurisdições notificar, pela incerteza de quais efeitos as operações podem gerar e o que isso poderia levar ou até um gun jump na discussão sobre os efeitos de eventuais mercados, e se já teve algum caso concreto de uma autoridade entender que a operação poderia gerar algum efeito e as partes não, e ter essa discussão de gun jump exatamente por causa dos efeitos do mercado e da definição.
To the lawyers, so I thought I was called out. I mean, since it's murder, I can respond, and the rest I was silent. I mean, the gun jumping issue, we have very strict rules to determine whether we have jurisdiction or not, which are based on geographical location of turnover. Obviously, I guess maybe your question is linked to the issue of whether the companies which provide services, maybe they are big companies but no revenues. But actually, obviously, if these objective thresholds set in Article 1 of our merger regulation are not met, I mean, we cannot ask for, like, you know, the company not to merge unless, obviously, the transaction has to be notifiable in other jurisdictions in the EU, and then there are, let's say, rules that allow the transaction to be then referred to us, and that, for example, Facebook WhatsApp was a case that was not notifiable to the Commission due to the very low turnover of WhatsApp, but also Apple Shazam. But eventually, we got the opportunity to look at, because the transaction was catched in the EU, and there was this mechanism of referral. There is a discussion about threshold, it's still ongoing, whether we should review on this. My personal view, and as everything I said here, this is my personal view and does not necessarily reflect the official opinion of the European Commission, is that so far, for what we have seen, we managed to look at the transactions that we thought were interesting and where an impact there could have been or not. Actually, both the transactions I mentioned were cleared. So far, I think it's okay. In some of our countries, that's actually one of the reasons that could maybe even further improve this mechanism. So Germany and Austria, they've introduced some transaction thresholds, so not only based on turnover, but also the value of the transaction, and this maybe allow us to catch some further transactions.
So maybe just one comment from the U.S. perspective on that. I think it's a specific issue of, can you capture, as a regulator, can you capture these types of transactions is a little easier from our perspective for 2 reasons. One, our thresholds really don't look at whether there's revenue, with some exceptions involving non-US companies. They're purely based on the size of the transaction and the size of the parties, and if the transaction is valuable enough and the thresholds by international standards are extraordinarily low, it's reportable. And the other characteristic of the U.S. system is that the agencies have jurisdiction regardless of whether it's reportable or not. And so the reportability is really only a matter of, do you have to bring it to the attention of the government? Does not define whether they can investigate or not.
Okay. Muito obrigada, Eleonora e Harmut. Bom, acho que a gente poderia continuar debatendo mais muito tempo, mas nosso tempo se esgotou. Então, gostaria de agradecer novamente as excelentes contribuições dos painelistas aqui e já anunciar o próximo painel, que vai ser a entrevista com as autoridades. Por favor, fiquem aqui, porque não vai haver intervalo, não vai ter coffee break agora. Então, a gente vai trocar a mesa. Muito obrigada a todos, gente.